All right, so I've got a wild story for you today. It's about what happens when a classic video game, a super dedicated speedrunner, and, get this, a particle from deep space all crash into each other in the weirdest way possible. So let's just jump right in. It all kicks off with this headline that honestly sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie. You've got a player, right? They're trying to set a new world record in Super Mario 64, pushing that game to its absolute breaking point, and then boom, something happens that just shouldn't be possible.
So here's exactly what went down. Mario gets stuck under a platform, run over, right? But then, out of nowhere, a single, tiny little switch inside the Nintendo 64's memory, what we call a bit, flips from a 0 to a 1, just one. That one little flip changes the number that tells the game how high Mario is, and poof, he teleports straight up, right through the platform. The run is saved, and the suspected culprit for this miracle? A cosmic ray.
I know, it sounds completely nuts, doesn't it? How on earth can a particle from some star millions of light years away just reach down and mess with a video game? Well, to wrap our heads around this, we've got to go back to basics. We need to talk about the very foundation of how computers remember anything at all. Tiny little switches we call bits.
All right, let's jump into our first section. We're going to dig into the physics of how a glitch like this is even physically possible.
You know, at its core, computer memory is just a sea of billions of ones and zeros. And if you change just one of those, flip a 0 to a 1, you can completely change the data it represents. That's what a bit flip is. It's when one of those switches gets flipped, not by the computer's logic, but by some outside force. For Mario, that one flip was the difference between being stuck and teleporting to victory.
And believe it or not, this crazy thing has a name. It's called a single event upset, or an SEU for short. And it's a very real problem. It happens when a single particle, like a cosmic ray, just happens to zip through a microchip and slam into a sensitive spot with just enough energy to flip a bit. It's basically a random glitch caused by radiation, and for people designing satellites or spacecraft, this is a huge deal.
Yeah, this isn't a new discovery. As you can see here, engineers have known about SEUs for a long, long time. We're talking predictions way back in the 60s, and it was a real-world headache for spacecraft by the late 70s. But here's the thing. As our tech keeps shrinking and we cram more and more transistors closer together, these random space particles are starting to matter, even down here on the ground. And that Mario glitch, it's probably the most famous example ever. So, the big point here is that the Mario glitch, as amazing and random as it was, accidentally pointed a giant spotlight on a physical weakness in our computer memory, a weakness that's in almost every device we use. And that leads to a much darker question. What if you could make these bit flips happen on purpose? And that's where things take a turn. This brings us to the dark side of bit flips, where they aren't accidents at all. Welcome to the Rowhammer attack. So, what is Rowhammer? It's a straight-up hardware vulnerability. The best analogy is to think about your computer's memory like floors in an apartment building. If you start stomping on the floor in your apartment, the aggressor row, over and over and over again, really, really fast, you can actually cause enough electrical disturbance that things start falling off the shelves in your neighbor's apartment downstairs, the victim row. You never went into their apartment, but you still managed to mess with their stuff. That's Rowhammer. And this is where the difference becomes crystal clear. An SEU, the Mario glitch, that's caused by a random particle from space. It's an act of God, basically. An accident. But Rowhammer? That's caused by a piece of software designed to do it. It's completely intentional and malicious. And the goal isn't just to scramble some data, it's to create a security breach, to punch a hole through the most basic security walls a computer has. Now, when this was first discovered back in 2014, the findings were pretty terrifying. In a lab setting, researchers found that a whopping 85% of the memory chips they tested were vulnerable. 85%. But, okay, that's in a lab. The big question is, how does that translate to the real world?
And that brings us to Section 3, taking this to a real-world test. We have to find out just how big of a threat is this really, outside the lab, on the actual computers that you and I use every day. So, to get an answer, a team of researchers launched a really cool project called FlippyRAM, and the goal was simple: to do the first ever large-scale automated study to see just how common Rowhammer vulnerabilities are out there in the wild.
And the way they did it was, frankly, genius. They handed out thousands of bootable USB sticks. Volunteers could just plug one in, boot up their computer, and run this special software. The software would first try to map out that specific computer's memory, which is different for almost every machine. And then it would unleash a whole battery of different rowhammer attacks to see if it could force any bit flips. And the best part? All the results could be uploaded anonymously to help the study. And people really came through. They collected over 1,000 different data sets from more than 800 unique computers over about 6 months. For the first time, we had a really clear, large-scale picture of what this problem looks like across all sorts of different hardware. Okay, so they got all this data. What's the bottom line? Let's get right into the findings. So this chart is really interesting. It shows that the first big roadblock for an automated attack is just figuring out the memory layout. Look at that. The tools couldn't even map the memory on more than half the systems. So this tells us that pulling off a rowhammer attack in the real world isn't exactly a walk in the park. It's a real technical challenge. But here's the kicker. For the systems they could map, the results were pretty stark. About 12.5%, that's 1 in every 8 computers they tested, were vulnerable to an automated rowhammer attack. Now, that's way less than the 85% from the lab, for sure, but think about it. 1 in 8 computers is still a massive number of vulnerable machines out there. Digging deeper, they found that the age of your memory really matters. If you have older DDR3 RAM, which a lot of people still do, it was vulnerable over a quarter of the time. Newer DDR4 RAM, which actually has some protections built in, was way better, but still vulnerable almost 9% of the time. So yeah, the fixes are helping, but they're clearly not a silver bullet. And it even came down to the brand. The manufacturer makes a huge difference. Memory from Samsung and Hynix was vulnerable around 30% of the time, but chips from Micron? Only about 2.5%. That tells you that something about how Micron makes their chips makes them way more resistant to this kind of attack. So what's the big takeaway here? This is so much more than just some obscure bug. What this proves is that the physical foundation of computing, the actual silicon chips, isn't perfect. It can be manipulated. A piece of software with no special permissions can literally break hardware security. This opens the door for an attacker to gain more and more control until they own the entire system. It really highlights this constant cat-and-mouse game between discovering these deep hardware flaws and trying to build defenses against them. And that really brings us full circle, doesn't it? We started this journey with a 1 in a billion cosmic ray giving a Mario player a lucky break. And we ended up with a weaponized hardware flaw that's present in 1 out of every 8 computers out there. It really forces you to stop and ask a pretty unsettling question. Everything we do digitally, our entire online lives, is built on these tiny physical memory cells. How secure can any of it really be if its very foundation can be shaken this easily?